In the year of our Lord 1665, London was a city gasping for air. The Great Plague had wrapped its skeletal fingers around its throat, and the metropolis had become a sprawling charnel house. The air, thick and heavy, carried a morbid perfume, a nauseating blend of burnt flesh from purifying bonfires, the cloying sweetness of decay, and the acrid tang of herbal remedies that offered more comfort than cure. Each day, the mournful tolling of church bells provided a ceaseless soundtrack to the macabre procession of death carts navigating the narrow, filth-strewn streets. Panic was a fever unto itself, with many believing the pestilence to be the wrath of a vengeful god. It was in this maelstrom of fear and societal collapse, where a neighbor's life was worth less than a rumor, that true monsters found the perfect darkness in which to shed their human masks. Amid this unyielding despair, one man stood as a solitary beacon of hope, Dr. Alistair Blackwood. His name was whispered with a reverence usually reserved for saints. Publicly, Dr. Blackwood was the very picture of piety and selfless dedication. While others fled, he walked into the belly of the beast, his famous bird-like mask a symbol not of terror, but of unwavering courage. He was a hero, praised by the city's aldermen and blessed by the common folk, a man who risked his own life to tend to the afflicted in a convent that had been hastily converted into a makeshift hospital. His demeanor was always serene. His hands, though often stained with the grim realities of his work, moved with a gentle, reassuring precision. He spoke of science and faith as two sides of the same coin, offering not just medicine, but also spiritual solace to families ravaged by the disease. This facade was his greatest instrument, a meticulously crafted shield of virtue that rendered him utterly beyond suspicion. No one could have conceived of the profound, chilling heresy that festered behind his calm, compassionate eyes, a perversion of science that twisted the sacred act of healing into a litany of damnation. We find our first archival record in the fleeting image of a single, desperate family, the Holloways, their faces a canvas of grime and anguish under the sickly yellow lamplight. They stood before Dr. Blackwood, presenting their last surviving child, a young daughter named Eleanor, whose shallow breaths were a testament to the plague's relentless march. They had nothing left to offer but their trust, a fragile currency in a bankrupt world. The doctor, a silhouette of salvation against the backdrop of a dying city, offered them a placid smile that seemed to momentarily push back the shadows. He spoke in low, measured tones, promising a place in his private Douairi's isolated infirmary, a sanctuary where she would receive privileged care, away from the squalor and the certainty of the mass graves. For the Holloways, his words were not just a promise, they were a gospel, the final prayer of a family on the brink of utter annihilation, a prayer they believed was being answered. With a tenderness that belied the cold calculus taking place in his mind, Dr. Blackwood gently lifted the feverish girl from her mother's trembling arms. The scene was one of tragic grace, the stoic savior carrying the innocent victim away from the precipice. The camera of our historical lens follows his deliberate, unhurried steps as he crosses the muddy courtyard toward a separate wing of the convent, a stark and foreboding structure set apart from the general ward. The family remained frozen in place, their eyes fixed on his retreating form, a mixture of profound relief and a primal, unspoken dread warring within them. He did not look back. Each step he took widened the chasm between the world of the living and the unholy sanctum he had built for himself. The child, limp in his embrace, was no longer a patient to be healed, but a specimen to be catalogued, a new entry for a ledger no one else was ever meant to see. The final, definitive moment of this tragic tableau was not a word, but a sound. As Dr. Blackwood disappeared inside his infirmary, the heavy oak door swung shut behind him. It was a massive thing, reinforced with thick iron bands, designed not merely to close but to seal. The sound it made was no gentle click of a latch but a deep, resonant thud, a sound of absolute finality, like a coffin lid being hammered into place. For a long moment, that single, percussive sound hung in the damp air, an acoustic tombstone marking the end of Eleanor Holloway's short life. Then, it was swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the London night, a silence broken only by the distant wail of a grieving mother and the ceaseless tolling of the bells. The family was left outside, staring at the unforgiving wood of the door, forever separated from their daughter by a barrier far more terrible than they could ever imagine. Centuries have passed, and the London of 1665 is buried under layers of steel and glass. Yet, in a forgotten corner of the city, the skeleton of that very building still stands. The infirmary is now a ruin, a collection of crumbling stone walls choked with ivy, its gaping windows like hollow and vacant eyes staring out into a world that has tried to forget. The land is considered poisoned, not by plague, but by memory. Locals, even in this age of cynical reason, give the place a wide berth, particularly as dusk bleeds into night. They speak in hushed tones of the cursed doctor and his phantom hospital. It is said that if you stand near the ruins on a quiet night, you can still hear the stifled screams from within its walls, not the laments of the sick, but the cries of the souls he trapped there, an eternal, agonizing echo of their suffering, a stain on the city's very soul. This legend, born from a horror far worse than the plague itself, is an echo that has managed to travel through the centuries, a chilling testament to the fact that the greatest monsters often wear the mask of virtue. And since these dark histories have a way of reaching across time, we ask you to mark your presence in this investigation. Tell us in the comments from which city, and at what exact time, you are joining us as we unseal this forbidden archive. With your presence now recorded in our own ledger, let us return to that year of dread. We must now uncover the first subtle cracks that began to appear in the impeccable facade of Dr. Alistair Blackwood, the clues that one observant soul started to piece together in the shadow of his hallowed reputation. In the grim theater of the plague-stricken convent, the days bled into one another, each marked by the same relentless rhythm of prayer and death. Sister Agnes, young, but with eyes that held the weary wisdom of one who had seen too much, moved through the makeshift wards like a silent, steady shuttle on a loom, weaving threads of comfort through a tapestry of despair. She was one of several nuns who had devoted themselves to this harrowing work, but there was an intensity to her observance, a quiet refusal to become numb to the horrors surrounding her. She cleaned sores, whispered prayers for the dying, and maintained a profound, compassionate focus in a world that had surrendered to chaos. It was this meticulous attention to the world around her, this inability to simply look away, that would become both her burden and the city's only hope for revealing a darkness far more insidious than the plague itself. Her faith was her shield, but her observant nature was an unwitting weapon, being sharpened against the stone of daily atrocities. Among the chaos, Dr. Alistair Blackwood was an island of absolute competence. Where the nuns offered spiritual solace, he provided the decisive, authoritative presence of science. We have records from the city's aldermen, praising his unflinching resolve and revolutionary methods, and in their own desperate correspondences. He would stride into the main ward, his bird mask a bizarre totem of hope, and his gaze would cut through the panic. He moved with an economy of motion, his diagnoses quick, his instructions to the sisters firm and clear. To the terrified families, he was a demigod, his calm voice a balm against the hysteria. Sister Agnes, like everyone else, was initially in awe of him. He was the embodiment of the rational mind battling a merciless, irrational foe. He represented order against the encroaching tide of death, and in the early weeks, she saw his work as nothing short of miraculous, a testament to God working through the hands of a gifted, profoundly dedicated man. Agnes's role often involved assisting the doctor directly, a position she accepted with solemn diligence. She learned to identify the herbs he requested, to sterilize his gleaming instruments in boiling water until they shone, and, most importantly, to act as his scribe. In the main ward, she would follow his rounds, a small lap desk and ink pot in hand, dutifully recording his observations for the convent's general ledger. Patient exhibits severe distemper of the humors, he would dictate, his voice muffled by his mask, prescribe a poultice of mallow and rose to draw out the pestilential vapor. He taught her to see the plague not as a divine curse, but as a series of observable, physical phenomena. He was her mentor in the grim science of dying, and she was his most devoted pupil, absorbing every detail, eager to contribute to his seemingly sacred mission of saving whatever fragments of London could still be salvaged. Her admiration for him was total, her trust absolute. The first tremor of doubt was almost imperceptible. a subtle discord in the doctor's otherwise perfect symphony of order. It was late, and Agnes was tasked with transcribing the day's scattered notes into the formal archive, a duty she performed with her usual precision. As she compiled the records, she noticed a pattern. The ledgers for the general ward, the ones she often helped write, were clear and consistent, but the separate, dedicated ledger for the patients admitted to his private infirmary was a different entity altogether. These were the chosen few, the ones like Eleanor Holloway who were promised privileged care. As Agnes ran her finger down the columns, a cold knot began to form in her stomach. It was an accountant's anomaly, a bureaucratic inconsistency that felt strangely, profoundly wrong. The document was an official record, yet it seemed designed to obscure rather than to clarify, a deliberate fog settling over the fates of his most special patients. Her curiosity piqued by this clerical strangeness. She examined the infirmary ledger more closely under the flickering candlelight. The document, bound in fine, dark leather, was a testament to the doctor's meticulous nature, yet it was a selective meticulousness. Each patient's entry began with an exhaustive, almost voyeuristic catalog of their symptoms. He recorded the exact shade of their skin, the precise number of lesions, the specific cadence of their pained breathing. The pages were filled with a scientist's obsessive passion for data, but when Agnes's eyes moved to the column marked "Treatment Administered," the detail vanished. It was replaced by a recurring, frustrating vagueness. Phrases like application of a proprietary balm, administration of a restorative tonic, or simply continued observation were repeated for patient after patient. For a man so obsessed with documenting the disease, he was pathologically secretive about his supposed cures. It was a glaring omission, a blank space where the very heart of his work should have been. This disquieting discovery planted a seed of suspicion that soon found fertile ground. A few nights later, while delivering a late meal of broth and bread to the doctor's private study, a room adjacent to his infirmary, she experienced the second omen. She knocked softly, but there was no reply. Believing him to be asleep or deeply engrossed, she quietly pushed the door ajar. Dr. Blackwood was at his desk, but he was not writing in the official ledger. Instead, he was hunched over a smaller, personal journal, its cover made of worn, unmarked leather. He was so consumed by his work, his hand moving across the page with a feverish intensity, that he did not notice her presence in the doorway. He was guarding this book, not like a physician recording notes, but like a zealot protecting a sacred, forbidden text. The air in the room was different, charged with a private, almost unholy concentration. Before she could retreat, he shifted in his chair, allowing the candlelight to fall directly upon the open page. What she saw in that brief, stolen moment would be forever burned into the back of her mind. It was not a chart of symptoms or a recipe for a new remedy. It was an anatomical sketch, rendered with the breathtaking precision of a Da Vinci, but depicting a scene of unspeakable horror. It showed a human lung, not as a static organ in a textbook, but in a state of violent agitation, pierced by a thin, sharp object. Beneath it, written in the doctor's elegant, controlled script in Dao, were not medical observations Mao, but notes on the subject's audible reactions. She saw other drawings on the facing page, a diagram of a human hand, its fingers bent back at impossible angles, and a detailed rendering of an eye, its pupil unnaturally dilated. These were not studies of the plague's effects. They were illustrations of inflicted pain. Agnes pulled back from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen enough, but as she turned, a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The scratching of the quill inside the study stopped instantly. A heavy silence fell, thick and suffocating. She fled down the corridor, not daring to look back, the image of that grotesque illustration superimposed over the benevolent face of the man she had so admired. From that night on, everything changed. The doctor's demeanor towards her remained outwardly professional, but a new, glacial chill had entered his interactions. His eyes, once calm and reassuring, now seemed to dissect her whenever she was in his presence. He would single her out for praise in front of the Mother Superior, complimenting her passionate curiosity, in a tone that made the words sound like an indictment, a subtle threat veiled as a commendation. The very sensory details she had once associated with healing became instruments of psychological torment. The sharp, clean scent of alcohol and steel that clung to the doctor's coat, a smell she once found reassuringly sterile, now made her stomach clench with a primal fear. It was no longer the smell of a clean slate, but the smell of a sanitized crime scene. The gleam of his scalpels and bone saws, laid out in perfect order on a velvet cloth, no longer represented the noble tools of a surgeon. In her mind's eye, they were now extensions of the cruel, meticulous hand she had seen sketching in that secret journal. The juxtaposition was complete. The man of science was a veneer, and beneath it lay an artist whose medium was not ink or clay, but living human flesh. The tools of salvation had become the instruments of a meticulous and unspeakable damnation. Sister Agnes was now utterly alone, trapped in a prison of her own terrible knowledge. She had no tangible proof, only a collection of disturbing anomalies, a vague ledger, a fleeting glimpse of a monstrous drawing, and the unnerving shift in the doctor's gaze. To voice her suspicions against a man universally hailed as a hero would be to invite accusations of madness, or worse, demonic influence. The city was desperate for a savior, and it would not suffer a young nun to tarnish his name with what would surely be dismissed as hysterical fantasies. Yet, to remain silent was to become an unwilling accomplice, to watch as more patients were led through that heavy oak door, never to be seen again. The unease within her had festered into a constant, silent scream. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that a terrible truth lay in the abyss below, waiting for the one final push that would force her to jump. Among the countless souls adrift in the sea of London's misery was a young orphan boy named Thomas. He had been brought to the convent weeks earlier, a scrawny, hollow-eyed child who had lost his entire family to the first wave of the pestilence. Unlike many of the others, a spark of resilient life still danced in his eyes. Sister Agnes had grown particularly fond of him, seeing in his stubborn survival a flicker of the divine in a world that seemed forsaken by God. He would follow her through the wards, helping in small ways, his youthful presence a fragile counterpoint to the ever-present specter of death. He was not just another patient or another orphan. He was a symbol of a future that seemed increasingly impossible, a small, warm hand she could hold against the encroaching cold. Her affection for him was a quiet, desperate prayer for innocence to be spared. The inevitable day came when the spark in Thomas's eyes began to dim. He awoke with a fever, and by midday the telltale signs of the plague began to bloom upon his small frame. Agnes's heart sank. She tended to him personally, applying cool cloths to his forehead and speaking to him in soothing tones, but she knew the convent's general ward was little more than a place to die with a prayer on one's lips. As she watched the boy's condition worsen, a terrible conflict raged within her. Every instinct, sharpened by her recent discoveries, screamed at her to keep him away from Dr. Blackwood. Yet, the logical part of her mind, the part that still clung to the world as it was supposed to be, argued that the celebrated doctor was his only real hope for survival. To deny him that chance based on a half-glimpsed drawing and a vague ledger felt like a condemnation in itself. In the end, desperation won out over suspicion. Clinging to the hope that her fears were mere phantoms born of stress and exhaustion, Agnes made her choice. She would entrust Thomas to the doctor. It was an act of profound, agonizing faith not in God, but in the carefully constructed reputation of a man she secretly feared. She carried the boy, now weak and shivering, across the courtyard to the door of the private infirmary. It felt like a betrayal, a procession to a sacrificial altar. As she handed him over, she looked directly into Dr. Blackwood's eyes, searching for any sign of the monster she suspected, but found only the placid, professional calm of a physician. He reassured her with the same measured words he offered everyone, promising to apply his most advanced techniques. The heavy oak door thudded shut, sealing her hope and her dread inside with the boy. That night, sleep offered Agnes no sanctuary. Her small stone cell felt like a cage, her mind a torture chamber replaying the moment she had handed Thomas over. The serene mask of the doctor, which had once been a source of comfort, now haunted her. The memory of his grotesque anatomical sketches warred with his public persona as a savior. Was he a hero or a butcher? Had she saved Thomas or condemned him? Tormented by a premonition so powerful it felt like a physical illness, She found herself unable to pray. The familiar words of the Psalms felt like ashes in her mouth. An oppressive, visceral certainty grew within her that something was terribly wrong. It was a feeling that transcended logic and faith, a primal scream from the deepest part of her soul, demanding that she act. Unable to bear the suffocating confines of her cell any longer, she rose. A sliver of moonlight cut through the darkness of the corridor, illuminating a path through the sleeping convent. Every creak of the floorboards under her bare feet sounded like a thunderclap in the profound silence. The air was cold, carrying the distant metallic scent of the purifying bonfires that never ceased burning. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she made her way towards the doctor's wing, a place she was forbidden to go, a place that had become the epicenter of her terror. She was no longer a nun following the rules of her order. She was a hunter, drawn by an unseen force towards the lair of a predator, propelled by the desperate, unspoken plea of the boy she had left there. She reached the heavy oak door, the same one that had closed with such finality hours earlier. It was as imposing and silent as a tombstone. As she hesitated, her hand trembling just inches from the wood, she noticed it was not perfectly sealed. A minuscule crack near the floor, likely a flaw in the frame, allowed a thin, unwavering line of candlelight to bleed into the corridor. It was from this crack that the first sound emerged. It was not the weak, rattling cough of a plague victim, nor the delirious moan of a fever. It was a low, muffled groan, a guttural sound of resistance, of a body fighting against an external force. It was a sound she had never heard before in the convent, the sound of active, conscious pain being deliberately and methodically inflicted, her breath catching in her throat. Agnes knelt down on the cold stone floor, pressing her eye to the narrow crack. The world shrank to that tiny, horrifying sliver of light. The view was restricted, fragmented, but what she saw obliterated any last vestige of doubt. She saw not a scene of healing, but one of violation. There was the blinding glint of a polished steel scalpel moving with practiced precision under the candlelight. She saw the doctor's arm, his sleeve rolled up, moving in a steady, analytical way, and on the table, she saw the shadow of a small body convulsing, not with the tremors of fever, but with the desperate, futile struggle against restraints. He was not treating the plague. He was dissecting it from a living subject. He was charting the landscape of agony on the canvas of an innocent boy. A wave of nausea and horror so profound it nearly made her cry out, threatened to betray her presence. She scrambled back from the door, clapping a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a physical blow, a shard of ice in her soul. The man hailed as London's savior was a demon cloaked in the robes of a physician, a sadist performing his profane sacraments in a hidden torture chamber. She fled, stumbling through the darkened corridors, the image from the keyhole seared into her mind. The clean, sterile smell of his instruments, the placid look in his eyes, the praise of the alderman. It was all a monstrous lie, a performance of virtue designed to conceal an abyss of depravity. She had not just been mistaken, she had been a fool, an unwitting accomplice to his heresy. The following morning felt like a judgment. The sun rose on a world that was fundamentally broken. Agnes avoided the main ward, her grief and rage a volatile mixture threatening to erupt. It was Dr. Blackwood who found her, near the chapel. He approached with his usual unhurried stride, his expression unreadable. There was no pity in his eyes, only a cold, clinical observation. He stopped before her, and the entire convent seemed to hold its breath. "Sister Agnes," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, a flat, sterile report. "Regarding the orphan boy, Thomas, the proprietary treatments were unfortunately not enough to overcome the virulence of his affliction." He paused, his gaze boring into her, waiting, watching. He did not make it through the night. The words were a death sentence and a challenge, confirming the murder while daring her to question it. Her world had been reduced to two undeniable truths. The boy was dead, and this man had killed him. The grief for Thomas was a sharp, physical pain, but beneath it, a new and terrible resolve began to harden. The doctor's cold pronouncement was not an end. It was a declaration of war. Her fear, once a paralyzing force, now began to transmute into a cold, focused fury. She met his gaze, her own eyes no longer holding the deference of a student, but the steely glint of an accuser. She said nothing, letting her silence answer him. In that moment, the power dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. She was no longer just a suspicious nun, she was a witness, and her silent investigation was about to begin in earnest, fueled by the memory of a muffled groan and the glint of a scalpel in the dark. Grief, in the crucible of 1665, was a common currency, but what Sister Agnes felt was a different, more volatile metal. It was not the passive sorrow of loss, but the white-hot forge of purpose. The memory of Thomas, reduced to a cold, clinical lie from the doctor's lips, had burned away her fear, leaving behind a core of unyielding resolve. She now understood the terrible calculus of her situation. No one would believe her word against that of London's celebrated savior. The Mother Superior would see it as hysteria born of grief. The city alderman would dismiss it as the slander of an overwrought nun. To expose the monster, she could not simply speak of the darkness. She had to bring a piece of it into the light. Her path was clear, a terrifying, solitary course. She had to enter the serpent's den and steal its venomous scripture. She had to get her hands on that secret journal. Her mission became a silent, obsessive hunt for opportunity. She shadowed the doctor's movements not with the deference of an assistant, but with the predatory patience of a stalker. For 3 agonizing days, she watched and waited, her prayers now silent, pleas not for salvation, but for a single moment of carelessness from her quarry. The moment finally arrived on a Thursday afternoon, shrouded in the city's perpetual gray gloom. A messenger, his face pale with urgency, arrived bearing a summons from a Lord Mayor whose wife had taken a turn for the worse. Dr. Blackwood, ever the public servant, gathered his things with his usual composed haste. Agnes watched from a cloister window as he crossed the courtyard, his silhouette a stark, dark line against the misty air. The study, his profane sanctuary, was finally unguarded. It was an invitation from Providence she could not refuse. Moving through the stone corridors felt like walking through a dream, the world muffled and distant. The only reality was the frantic beating of her own heart and the small, iron key she had managed to lift from a hook in the dispensary, a master key she had once seen the doctor use. She reached the imposing oak door, its surface cold and indifferent. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. The metallic scrape was deafening in the silence, a sound of profound transgression. With a heavy, grating click, the lock turned. She pushed the door open just enough to slip through, closing it softly behind her, plunging herself into the lion's den. The air inside was still and cool, a stark contrast to the humid decay of the convent wards, a pocket of manufactured calm in the heart of the storm. The study was a temple to meticulous order. Every book was perfectly aligned on its shelf, every vial and jar arranged by size and color. On a side table, his surgical instruments were laid out on a velvet cloth, their polished steel surfaces gleaming under the weak afternoon light filtering through a grimy window. The room carried his signature scent, the sharp, clean smell of alcohol and medicinal herbs, but underlying it was something else, a faint, coppery and vaguely sweet odor that turned her stomach. It was the smell of a pristine abattoir. She felt a crushing sense of violation, of standing on ground that was fundamentally unholy. There was no time to waste. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the small, leather-bound book, the repository of his sins. She found it not locked away in a strongbox, but tucked between 2 large medical encyclopedias on his primary bookshelf. The arrogance was breathtaking. He believed himself so untouchable that his greatest secrets could hide in plain sight. She pulled the book from the shelf. The leather cover was worn smooth with use, its surface unmarked by any title or insignia. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the gravitas of its contents. Her fingers trembled as she untied the simple leather cord that held it shut. For a moment, she hesitated, the full weight of her trespass threatening to paralyze her. This was the point of no return. Opening this book would be like reading a chapter from a devil's personal gospel, and the knowledge within would be a burden she would carry forever. With a final, steadying breath, she opened the journal. The first page was not a diary entry, but a chilling manifesto, written in the same elegant, controlled script she had seen before. "It is the belief of this physician," it began, that the Great Plague is not a punishment, but an opportunity. It is a crucible sent to burn away the sentimentality that clouds our understanding of the human machine. While others pray, I shall dissect. While they seek solace in the hereafter, I will map the uncharted territories of the here and now, the architecture of pain, the resilience of the flesh, and the precise moment the soul's tether is severed by methodical, applied stress. This is not a record of cures, but a catalogue of responses, a bestiary of mortal limits. The language was that of a philosopher, the ambition that of a god, the morality that of a vacuum. Flipping through the pages, a gallery of horrors unfolded before her. Each entry was a methodical, clinical account of a human being's deconstruction. The book was organized by subject, identified only by an initial and a brief physical description. She saw the intricate sketches again, but now they were accompanied by chillingly detached annotations. Subject K, female, est, 19 years. Graduated pressure applied to the femoral artery. Notes on the progression of discoloration in the lower limb. Subject lost coherence after 47 minutes. Began speaking to her deceased mother. Another read. Subject F, male, robust build. Testing the tensile strength of ligaments. The audible pop of the patellar tendon occurred at a pressure of 42 pounds. Subject's vocalizations were of a remarkable tenor. It was a litany of torment, documented with the dispassionate curiosity of a botanist studying wilting flowers. Then, with a sickening lurch in her gut, she found the entry she was dreading and seeking in equal measure. Subject T, juvenile male, frail constitution. It was Thomas. Her eyes, blurred with tears, she refused to let fall. Scanned the page. Initial experiments with nerve stimulation via needlepoint proved difficult due to subject's constant struggling. A solution of nightshade and mercury was administered to induce paralysis and observe its effect on the cardiac rhythm. Hypothesis was that the paralytic agent would quiet the body but not the heart. Instead, subject suffered a violent seizure, followed by rapid systemic failure. The data is thereby corrupted. A disappointing and inefficient specimen. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Thomas, her symbol of hope, was reduced to a failed experiment, his death an inconvenience. Her gaze fell upon another name, one that resonated with a different kind of dread. Constable Miller, the parish lawman, a good and honest man whose young son had been one of the first to be taken into Blackwood's private care weeks ago, only to succumb a day later. The entry for Subject M, Jr., was horrifyingly specific, testing the effects of prolonged oxygen deprivation. Subject revived 3 times before the final expiration. The resilience of the young is a field deserving of further, more focused study. Lungs and heart preserved for anatomical comparison. Agnes realized in that moment that she was holding not just evidence, but a weapon, a key to unlocking an ally. To accuse the doctor alone was madness, but to present a grieving, respected father with irrefutable proof of his child's torture, that was a path to justice. She knew she could not take the entire journal. Its absence would be noticed immediately. Her only option was to remove a single page, a single piece of incontrovertible proof. With hands that shook uncontrollably, she carefully tore out the page detailing the experiments on Constable Miller's son. The sound of the ripping paper was a violent desecration, a scream in the silent room. She folded the gruesome document and tucked it deep within the folds of her habit, a secret wound against her skin. She then slid the journal back into its place on the shelf, the tiny gap left by the missing page a silent testament to her crime. The act was done. She had stolen a page from the devil's playbook, and now she had to escape the library of hell before its keeper returned. Just as she was turning to leave, she heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor, heavy, deliberate, and approaching fast. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. Blackwood was back. He had returned far sooner than she had anticipated. There was no time to use the main door. Her eyes darted around the room, frantically searching for an escape. She saw a thick tapestry on the far wall, depicting a grim biblical scene, a desperate gamble. She darted behind it, pressing herself flat against the cold and damp stone, her breath held tight in her chest. The space was barely deep enough to conceal her. She prayed that her homespun brown habit would blend into the shadows. that her frantic heartbeat was not as loud as it sounded in her own ears. The door opened and Dr. Blackwood entered the study. He stood motionless for a moment, and Agnes could feel his presence, a palpable aura of cold intelligence that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. She risked a glance through a small gap in the tapestry's weave. He wasn't looking around. He was simply standing there, as if sniffing the air, sensing that his sanctum had been disturbed. His head tilted slightly, like a predator detecting a foreign scent on the wind. He walked to his desk, his movements economical and precise. He did not immediately check the journal. Instead, he ran a gloved finger along the spines of the books on his shelf, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second on the spot where the journal sat. He knew. He did not call out. He did not search the room. The silence was his weapon. He simply went about his work, the scratching of his quill on a fresh sheet of paper filling the void. It was a terrifying war of nerves, a calculated act of psychological torture. He knew someone had been there, and he wanted them to stew in their own fear. Agnes remained frozen behind the tapestry for what felt like an eternity, muscles screaming, her mind reeling. After an unbearable length of time, he rose, tidied his desk, and left the room, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. She waited, counting to 500 before daring to slip out from her hiding place and flee back to the relative safety of the convent's main corridors, the stolen page feeling like a burning coal against her skin. The next day, the open war began, but it was a war of whispers and glances. Dr. Blackwood's demeanor toward her was unchanged on the surface, still polite, still professional, but his eyes were different. When he looked at her, it was no longer with the detached gaze of a superior, but with the focused, analytical stare of a vivisectionist examining a new specimen. He held her gaze for moments longer than necessary, a silent challenge, a clear and chilling message. "I know it was you." He would compliment her diligence in front of the other sisters, his words dripping with a venomous irony only she could detect. He was playing with her, enjoying her fear, confident in his own untouchable position. He was a spider, and he was content to watch the fly struggle in his web. His counterattack was as subtle as it was devastating. 2 days after the infiltration, the Mother Superior summoned Agnes to her office. The older woman's face, usually stern but fair, was etched with a profound and pitying concern. "Sister Agnes," she began, her voice gentle, "Dr. Blackwood has expressed his worries for you. He speaks of the immense strain you are under. He told me you have been withdrawn, that you suffer from sleeplessness and have been seen wandering the halls at night." Agnes felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Blackwood wasn't just intimidating her. He was methodically dismantling her credibility, painting her as a hysterical, fragile creature on the verge of a breakdown. He was building her a cage of public opinion, preparing to lock her inside it. The Mother Superior continued, her words a gentle hammer driving the nails into Agnes's coffin of sanity. "He fears your grief for the boy Thomas has unsettled your mind, sister. He suggested you have been speaking of dark conspiracies, of seeing things that are not there. He recommends a period of rest, of prayer and seclusion, away from the grim realities of the ward." The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. He was using her own genuine trauma as the foundation for her fabricated madness. He was isolating her, turning her own superiors against her, ensuring that when she finally spoke the truth, it would be dismissed as the ravings of a mind broken by the plague. The doctor had made his move, and it was a checkmate against her sanity. Agnes left the office in a daze, the Mother Superior's concerned gaze following her out. The convent, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison where she was the sole sane inmate in an asylum run by its most dangerous patient. The whispers of the other nuns, their pitying glances, they all confirmed it. The doctor's poison was working. She was now utterly alone, a ghost in her own life. But as she walked through the cold, echoing cloister, her hand instinctively went to the folded page hidden in her habit. The crisp, rough paper was a tangible anchor in a sea of psychological warfare. It was the one piece of truth in a world built of lies. It was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was her last will and testament, and her only hope for an ally. Her path led her away from the convent, out into the foul, miasmic air of the London streets. She was breaking her vows, leaving the grounds without permission, but the rules of God and man seemed a distant, irrelevant memory. Her purpose was singular, her destination fixed. She was heading to the small parish office of Constable Miller. She did not know if the man would believe her. She did not know if he would cast her out as a lunatic or hand her back over to the doctor's care. All she knew was that she held the story of his son's final, agonizing hours in her hand. She was about to hand a grieving father a lit torch and point him toward the man who had burned his world to the ground, praying he would have the courage to use it. The parish office of Constable Miller was a small bastion of order against the city's tide of chaos. The air smelled of beeswax, old paper, and the damp wool of his uniform. Miller himself was a man carved from granite and duty, his face a landscape of grief since the loss of his son, Michael, but his eyes were sharp, grounded in the hard facts of a world that had little room for fantasy. When Sister Agnes appeared before him, disheveled and wild-eyed, her habit stained with the grime of the city streets, his first reaction was one of pitying skepticism. He saw not a harbinger of truth, but the very image of the unhinged nun Dr. Blackwood's rumors had described. She was another victim of the plague's psychological toll, a mind fractured by sorrow, and he prepared to gently dismiss her with kind, empty words. Agnes, however, did not begin with frantic accusations. Her voice, though trembling, was steady, her narrative methodical. She spoke not of monsters, but of inconsistencies. She laid out her observations with the precision of a witness giving a statement. The meticulously vague entries in the private ledger, the patients who improved only to suddenly succumb after a private visit from the doctor, the muffled groan she had heard from behind the sealed infirmary door. Constable Miller listened, his expression unchanged, his posture that of a man accustomed to hearing tales of panic and delusion. He had immense respect for the Mother Superior, who had already spoken to him of her concern for Agnes's fragile state. Every word the nun spoke seemed to confirm the doctor's diagnosis of her hysteria, not his guilt. He was about to thank her for her concern and send her away. Then, she reached into her habit. Her next action was not a plea, but a presentation of evidence. With trembling fingers, she unfolded a single, creased page of paper and laid it flat on the surface of his cluttered wooden desk. The candlelight caught the elegant, precise script and the horrifyingly detailed anatomical diagrams that accompanied it. "This is a page from his personal journal," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He keeps a record of what he calls his experiments. This is the entry for your son, Michael." The air in the small office became instantly thick and heavy. The document lay between them, a declaration of war written in the ink of a madman and the blood of an innocent, a piece of paper that held the power to shatter a father's world all over again, or to finally give his grief a target. Constable Miller stared at the page, his professional detachment a fragile dam against a rising flood of horror. He picked it up. His hands, usually so steady, shook as his eyes traced the cold, clinical words. "Subject M, Jr.," it began, followed by a terrifyingly accurate physical description of his son. The text then described not a treatment for plague, but a methodical test of oxygen deprivation, the process of resuscitation, and the final, fatal expiration, all noted with the dispassionate curiosity of an entomologist studying an insect. The dam broke. The grief he had buried under layers of duty and resignation erupted into a white-hot, silent rage. This was not a document of madness. It was a confession. The elegant script was not the mark of a scholar, but the signature of a butcher. The abstract horror of the plague was suddenly replaced by the tangible, personal evil of a single man. The constable did not weep or shout. The horror distilled his rage into a lethal, cold purpose. He looked up at Agnes, and in his eyes, she no longer saw a skeptic, but a fellow survivor, a grim ally forged in the crucible of shared truth. He folded the page with deliberate care and handed it back to her. "The aldermen will not act on this," he stated, his voice flat and hard as iron. "They need their hero. Blackwood is protected by the very hope he manufactured." He stood, his decision made in an instant. "We cannot bring the law to him. We will bring a reckoning." He began to outline a plan, not as a constable, but as a predator. They would go that night, not with the authority of the city, but with the authority of justice. They would not be conducting an official raid. They would be leading a righteous hunt. Miller did not summon the official city watch. He knew Blackwood's influence was a poison that had seeped into every level of the city's administration. Instead, he moved through the darkened streets, a shadow recruiting other shadows. His first stop was the forge of Elias Thorne, a giant of a man whose shoulders were slumped not from work, but from the loss of his only daughter weeks earlier, another of Blackwood's failed cases. He then found two former soldiers, men loyal to Miller and hardened by campaigns abroad, who understood orders that came from a place beyond official sanction. This small, grim company of four, united by loss and a trust in their constable, gathered in a rain-slicked alley. Their weapons were not swords and muskets, but crowbars, heavy mallets, and the lanterns that would illuminate the darkness they were about to confront. Their mission was unspoken but universally understood. Under the cloak of a moonless, overcast sky, the small party moved through London's labyrinthine streets. They were specters in a city of ghosts, their determined silence a stark contrast to the distant wails of grief and the ceaseless tolling of the death bells. They reached the convent grounds, not through the guarded main gate, but over a crumbling section of the rear stone wall. Every rustle of their clothing, every dislodged pebble underfoot, seemed to echo in the oppressive quiet. They approached the doctor's isolated infirmary, a block of solid darkness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. It stood as a silent monument to Blackwood's hubris. The blacksmith, Elias Thorne, hefted his iron crowbar, the muscle in his jaw tight. This was the door that had swallowed his daughter, and he was here to tear it from its hinges. With a grunt of exertion, Thorne jammed the crowbar into the seam of the heavy oak door. The screech of tortured metal and the sharp crack of splintering wood shattered the night silence. The sound was a desecration, a violent intrusion into the pristine, controlled world the doctor had built. They burst through the ruined doorway, lanterns held high, casting frantic, dancing shadows across the walls of the study. The room was just as Agnes had described it, impeccably clean, instruments gleaming on velvet, the air sharp with the sterile scent of alcohol. It was a room that screamed of science and order, but beneath that clean veneer, another odor asserted itself, faint, sweet, and metallic. It was the smell of a meticulously scrubbed slaughterhouse, and it confirmed they were in the right place. The beast was not here, but his lair was ripe with his scent. They moved methodically from the study into the adjoining infirmary. The scene that greeted them was unnerving in its sterility. Several beds lined the walls, each one perfectly made, the white sheets crisp and untouched. There were no signs of patients, no discarded bandages, no evidence that this was a place of healing or even of sickness. It felt like a stage set, a facade designed to be viewed from a distance but never closely inspected. For a moment, the two soldiers exchanged a look of doubt. This was not the scene of horror they had been led to expect, but Constable Miller's focus was unwavering, his belief in the truth of the stolen page absolute. He turned to Agnes. "You said the sound came from below," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Show me where." Agnes led them to the center of the main examination room, a space dominated by a large, heavy operating table. She pointed to a thick, ornate rug that covered most of the floor. "Here," she whispered. The sound was beneath my feet. Thorne and one of the soldiers heaved the heavy rug aside, revealing the dusty floorboards beneath. Miller knelt, tapping the wood with the butt of his pistol. The sound was solid, solid, and then a distinct, hollow boom echoed back. It was undeniable. They had found it. The constable used the end of the crowbar to pry at the edges of the boards, revealing the faint, expertly concealed outline of a trapdoor. Thorne wedged the crowbar into the seam and pulled. With a loud groan of protesting wood, the door was wrenched open, releasing a blast of foul, cold air from the darkness below. It was the infirmary's signature scent, but 1,000 times more potent, a sickening miasma of rot, chemicals, and old blood. The lantern light cut a trembling yellow swath into the inky blackness, revealing a narrow, winding set of stone steps slick with a damp, unidentifiable slime. A profound, unnatural silence emanated from the space below. Constable Miller, his face a mask of grim determination, took the lead, his pistol held ready in one hand, a lantern in the other. He descended into the abyss, the others following close behind. The trapdoor left open to the world above like a fresh wound. The cellar was larger than they had imagined, a vaulted brick chamber that reeked of death and antiseptic. What the expanding circle of light revealed was a vision from a Hieronymus Bosch painting, a hellscape crafted by a human hand. This was not a storage cellar. It was a laboratory dedicated to the art of suffering and a museum for its grotesque results. On a large stone slab in the center of the chamber, like a profane altar, lay the confirmation of their worst fears. A man, gagged and bound with leather straps, was stretched out upon it. He was still alive. His eyes, the only part of him able to move freely, were wide with a terror so absolute it had gone beyond sound. His body was a canvas of the doctor's work, bearing fresh incisions and gruesome, half-finished mutilations. He was a piece of living anatomy, a specimen being studied in real time. The sight broke the last vestiges of the men's composure. A choked gasp escaped the blacksmith, a quiet curse from one of the soldiers. This single, breathing victim was more damning than 1,000 corpses, a living, suffering testament to the unholy work being conducted in this subterranean pit. If the living victim was the centerpiece, the walls were the gallery. They were lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, not holding wine or provisions, but row upon row of glass jars. Inside each, suspended in a murky yellowish fluid, was a piece of a human being. A lung, a liver, a severed hand, a pair of eyes that stared out into nothingness. Each jar was meticulously labeled with a small, parchment tag tied with string. Miller's lantern beam fell upon a jar containing a small, child's heart, its label bearing the simple, elegant script, Subject M, Junior. A few feet away, the blacksmith Thorne let out a guttural cry. He had found a jar holding a woman's hand, a simple silver ring still on its third finger, the ring he had given his daughter. The collection was a horrifying library of stolen lives, a monument to a meticulous, scientific sadism that defied all human comprehension. In the farthest, darkest corner of this hell, illuminated by the soft, steady glow of his own private lantern, they found him. Dr. Alistair Blackwood was seated at a small, tidy workbench, completely absorbed in his task. He was not cowering, nor was he preparing to fight. He was calmly using a fine-tipped quill to write out a new label for a freshly filled jar. He looked up as the group's light fell upon him, his expression not one of fear or guilt, but of pure, academic annoyance. It was the look of a scholar interrupted during a moment of profound concentration. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he asked, his voice a blade of ice, utterly devoid of emotion. "You have no right to be here. This is important, foundational work." In that final, chilling moment, they saw the man for what he was. Not a doctor, not a scientist, not even a monster in the traditional sense, but something far worse. A butcher, utterly serene in his work, who genuinely believed his art was more important than the lives he destroyed to create it. The discovery in Dr. Blackwood's cellar sent a tremor of horror through London, a shockwave more potent than any fear the plague had managed to inspire. The pestilence was a faceless, indiscriminate force of nature. This was a calculated, intimate evil, perpetrated by a man the city had elevated to the status of a living saint. The news spread not like a rumor, but like a contagion of its own, poisoning the very well of hope from which the citizens had been drinking. The man who walked into their homes, who touched their sick children with seemingly gentle hands, was a butcher collecting specimens. The betrayal was absolute, a spiritual wound that cut deeper than any physical ailment. London was left to grapple with a truth far more terrifying than the wrath of God, that the most depraved demon had worn the face of their most trusted savior, and they had welcomed him with open arms. In the immediate aftermath of his capture, Alistair Blackwood displayed no signs of madness, panic, or remorse. He was, according to the official records of his interrogations, eerily and unnervingly composed. He spoke of his victims not as people, but as subjects, variables, and biological datasets. When questioned about the boy Thomas, he expressed only frustration that the Gu specimen's unexpected seizure had corrupted the data on nerve responses. His confession, delivered in a calm, academic monotone, though, was not an admission of guilt, but a detailed explanation of his methodology. He viewed his actions as a necessary, if unpleasant, component of a grand scientific inquiry into the limits of human physiology. His only regret, he stated coolly, was that his foundational research had been interrupted by the sentimental hysterics of those who could not comprehend the importance of his work. His humanity was not broken, it was simply absent. The trial of Dr. Blackwood was a piece of public theater unlike any London had ever witnessed. It was not merely about securing a conviction, which was a foregone conclusion, but about performing a citywide exorcism. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous fury. Constable Miller provided a stoic, devastating account, his voice cracking only once when he identified the jar containing his son's heart. The blacksmith Elias Thorne, his large frame trembling with restrained violence, described the silver ring on the severed hand that had once belonged to his daughter. The greatest horror, however, came when the jars themselves, the doctor's ghastly library of pain, were brought into the court as evidence. A collective, guttural gasp of revulsion swept through the gallery, a sound of a city staring directly into the abyss it had unwittingly harbored. When given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, Dr. Blackwood did not plead for mercy or deny his actions. Instead, he rose and delivered a chilling, 10-minute lecture on the moral imperative of scientific progress. He argued that society, in its ignorance, had always persecuted its greatest visionaries. He painted his victims as unwitting, but necessary, martyrs for the advancement of anatomical knowledge, their suffering a small price to pay for the medical revelations his work would one day yield. He spoke of the Hippocratic Oath not as a vow to do no harm, but as a cowardly suggestion that limited true discovery. He presented himself not as a murderer, but as a pioneer, a man willing to make the hard choices that lesser men, blinded by empathy, could not. His defense was his final, most profound act of sadism, an intellectual vivisection of the very morality of his jurors. The verdict was immediate, the sentence swift and absolute. Dr. Alistair Blackwood was to be hanged at Tyburn, the city's infamous gallows. On the day of his execution, a massive, silent crowd gathered. There was no festive atmosphere that sometimes accompanied public hangings. The mood was somber, heavy, and grimly resolute. They had come not to celebrate a victory, but to witness the final, necessary cauterization of a gangrenous wound. As Blackwood stood upon the scaffold, the noose around his neck, he was granted the customary chance for last words. He scanned the sea of faces below him, his expression one of pure, intellectual contempt. He said nothing. He offered no confession, no prayer, no plea for forgiveness. He simply stared, his eyes cold and analytical to the very end, showing only disappointment that his great work would die with him. Then, the trap door fell. Even with Blackwood's death, the city remained profoundly scarred. The trust between the common citizen and the institutions meant to protect them, of medicine, of authority, of science, had been irrevocably shattered. How could one look at a physician's gleaming instruments and not see a butcher's tools? How could one accept a man's serene smile without suspecting the abyss that might lie behind it? The plague had been an assault on the body, but Blackwood's reign of terror was an assault on the city's soul. He had exploited their desperation, weaponized their hope, and turned their faith into an instrument of his own depravity. London, in its year of greatest vulnerability, had prayed for a savior and had been answered by a devil. This psychological poisoning would linger for generations, a deep-seated suspicion that the mask of virtue is often the most convincing one a monster can wear. The convent and its attached infirmary, once a place of refuge, and became an icon of pure terror almost overnight. The remaining nuns abandoned the site, unable to wash the stain of the doctor's atrocities from the stone walls. The church officially deconsecrated the ground, but it was a hollow gesture. For the people of London, the place was not merely unholy, it was a permanent wound on the city's map, an architectural scar oozing with the memory of unspeakable acts. No one dared to reclaim the building. It was left to the elements, to rot and crumble under the weight of its own dark history. Ivy crept over the walls, windows shattered, and the roof eventually collapsed, but the structure refused to be erased entirely, standing for centuries as a skeletal, foreboding ruin that locals would instinctively avoid, particularly after nightfall. It was in this period of decay that the historical horror began its metamorphosis into enduring legend. The story of Dr. Blackwood was stripped of its specific details and transformed into a potent cautionary tale. A boogeyman whispered to misbehaving children, "Be good, or the plague doctor will come for you." The ruins of his infirmary became the focus of local ghost stories. People claimed to hear the faint sounds of a woman weeping, the cries of a young boy, or, most chillingly, the metallic scrape of surgical tools on a quiet, windless night. The story became a warning that evil does not always announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. It often arrives wearing a benevolent mask, offering a helping hand, and speaking in a calm, reassuring voice. The legend ensured that Alistair Blackwood, the man, would never be forgotten. The tale of the cursed doctor thus became a dark parable, its echoes reaching far beyond the London fog. It forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question about the human condition, a question laid bare by the collapse of society during the Great Plague, when the structures of civilization, law, order, and communal trust are stripped away by widespread crisis. What is it that we truly reveal about ourselves? Does such a crucible forge heroes, tempered and strengthened by adversity? Or does it simply grant the monsters who have always walked among us the final, unspoken permission they need to stop hiding in the shadows? Blackwood was not created by the plague. He was merely unleashed by it. The chaos gave him the perfect darkness in which to practice his art, an art he had likely been perfecting in his mind for years. The ruins of the infirmary may no longer stand, but the story of Dr. Alistair Blackwood remains, a permanent entry in the archives of human darkness. His legacy is a chilling reminder that the capacity for profound evil can hide behind the most convincing facade of virtue, and that the greatest threat is often the one you invite willingly across your threshold. The narrative serves as a historical echo, a warning that must be preserved and retold, lest we forget the lessons written in the blood of the innocent. To ensure that these darkest chapters of our collective history are never sealed away or forgotten, subscribe to this channel and help us to keep a light burning in the vast, shadowed archives of the past. Your presence helps us to guarantee that these stories, and the warnings they contain, will never truly die.